Hi friends, my name is Jenny and I'm back today to do another video. Today I'm going to be going over all the books I read in the month of April as well as my stats for the month, so let's just get started. So over the course of April I managed to read 14 books, which for some reason I felt like I wasn't reading as much as I usually am, but this was the second highest reading month I've had so far this year, so I'm not really sure where that idea came from, but those 14 books did total to about 4,100 pages, and I realized I haven't been showing you my daily reading log that I put in my bullet journal. So here is what April ended up looking like. As you may know from my reading vlog that I did at the beginning of the month, I had this whole kind of time off of work, which is why it was a lot more than the rest of the month, but I do read about 100-ish pages a day on a pretty regular basis, so that's how my reading looked for the month of April. Then in terms of the gender of the authors that I read this month, 9 of the books were written by female authors, 3 books were written by male authors. I read 1 anthology that included authors of multiple genders, and then I read 1 book by a non-binary author. I also read 7 books by a white author, so about half of my reading this month, and the other half were authors of color, primarily black authors, but a few kind of other authors as well. In terms of format, I incorporated audiobooks in some way, either entirely listened to the book on audio or I mixed it with reading it physically for 3 of the books that I read this month. I also read 4 ebooks this month, and then the other 7 books I read only physically. All 14 books that I read this month were from my owned TBR shelf, so that does mean that I decreased my TBR in terms of this month's going in, going out ratio by 4 books. However, because of my birthday book haul that I did back in February, I still am up 3 books in terms of my physical TBR since the start of the year. However, I am down 1 book. This is kind of convoluted and confusing. I'm sorry. I am down 1 book from my total TBR, which includes my ebooks, because I keep those numbers separate just because physical books actually take up physical space as opposed to just sitting on my Kindle. So I have decreased my total TBR by 1 book since the start of the year. So I'm confident that in May, unless something crazy happens with my book buying, that I'll be able to decrease my physical TBR back to below where I started the year at this month, since it's only up 3 books, and I definitely will read more than 3 books, and I assume not bring in that many books. So that is kind of an update on that. In terms of the year published for the 14 books I read, 4 of the books were published this year in 2021, 3 of the books were published in 2020, and the rest were published prior to that, with the oldest book being published in 2005. So still in the last 20 years or so in terms of my reading this month, which is pretty standard. I don't read that many books published prior to 2000, I would say. 1 of the books that I read this month was categorized as a YA book, and the other 13 were adult books. I also finished 3 Reading Women prompts this month, which I will point out as we kind of go through the books. And then finally I read 4 nonfiction books, 1 poetry collection, and the other 9 books were fiction books. So those are all my stats for the month. Now to get into the actual reviews of these books, several of the books I have reviewed previously on my channel in 2 different vlogs that I did this month, so I'll be sure to link both of those vlogs up in the cards above as well as in the description box below if you want any more information on any of the books that I reviewed there, as I won't go into a ton of depth about them in this video. So starting as always with the book that I enjoyed the least and moving into the book that I enjoyed the most. The book I enjoyed the least this month was Overheated by Kate Aronoff, which I gave 2.5 stars. This one I talked about in my Reader of the Last Arc vlog for April, which as I said will be linked up above as well as in the description box below, and I didn't really get on with this one. It's very much an idealized solution to the climate crisis, and one that I didn't find particularly realistic or very well articulated, but I do go into depth quite a bit in that vlog, so do check that out if you're interested at all in this book. Then the next 2.5 star read I had this month was Bunny by Mona Awad, which I buddy read with Laurel Ann from Insert Book Pun Pier, which was really fun. Also, if you're not following or if you are not subscribed to Laurel Ann's channel, I would highly recommend her content. I really enjoy it, and she reads a lot of similar books to me. But this is a literary fiction novel that's set in an MFA program that's a very elite program. It's at a very elite institution, and we follow our main character Samantha, who doesn't get along with the other women in her program. She finds them very cliquey and just very kind of obnoxious to be around, and they are quite obnoxious, so who's to blame her really? But she gets kind of drawn into their circle, and it turns out that they're doing some pretty crazy stuff, and things just kind of go downhill from there. This book really, I feel like, was attempting to do something or make some commentary about MFA programs and elitism, particularly in terms of the relationship between the city that a school is in and the institution itself. However, the book got so caught up in its like weird premise that has to do with bunnies. I don't want to give too much away because it definitely is a book that I think unfolds in an interesting way, and so I don't want to spoil it for anyone who is interested. But I think Mona Awad just got too caught up in her idea of the horror weird elements that were happening in this book to actually make any commentary that I could vibe with. And I know Laurel Ann and I kind of felt very similarly about this. Like, I think other readers of this may enjoy it purely just for how weird it is and how crazy and off the wall it gets, but I think digging deeper into this book, there's not actually anything that Mona Awad is saying that is kind of nuanced and critical of this relationship between elite institutions and their community. In fact, it kind of falls privy to a lot of tropes of like mean girls being mean to each other for no reason, and also like our main character doesn't believe herself to be very privileged, but she actually is. And so there are just a lot of things that, like, looking at this book more critically, that I really didn't enjoy, and so for that reason I only gave it 2.5 stars, and I believe Laurel Ann also didn't really enjoy it. So Laurel Ann and I both would not recommend this book, but I did super enjoy reading it with Laurel Ann. I think that was a really fun experience, and I'm looking forward to doing so again in the future. Then the next book I actually finished in that April reading vlog, which was A Most Beautiful Thing by R. Cooper. This was a memoir about R. Cooper's experience on his high school's rowing team and how that impacted kind of the rest of his life. I thought it was fine. I gave it 3 stars. As I said, it was pretty average. I think the audiobook was pretty well done. I just am not a super huge fan of memoirs, nor am I a huge fan of sports, particularly rowing. I just don't find it that interesting. And this one was pretty kind of average in terms of its readability. It was much more about his story and not necessarily the writing itself, but if the subject matter interests you, I think you would probably enjoy it, but I just didn't super love it. Then the next book I also gave 3 stars, which is Gary Snyder's Danger on Peaks. This is the poetry collection that I read this month, and I talked a little bit about this one in my reading vlog as I started it during that time, but I finished it after I'd concluded the reading vlog. And I read Gary Snyder a bit in college, so I'm familiar with his work previously, and this is a somewhat recent collection of his. This is the book that came out in 2005, and so it's kind of just a collection of poetry that he's written since the 1970s until the present day, and some of the poems I connected with more than others. He definitely includes a lot of kind of nature and reflection. He's also a Buddhist, which is the way that I was kind of introduced to him. It was a religious studies class about the beatnik generation, which Gary Snyder was a part of, along with like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, who are kind of the more famous people in that generation of writers and thinkers. But they were all very interested in Buddhism, and of the group of people, Gary Snyder was the kind of most active practicing Buddhist. So Gary Snyder does also include a lot of ideas of Buddhism and reincarnation in his work, which I enjoy. I think he's a good poet. I find him pretty approachable, so I enjoy his work for that reason. I do think his work sometimes reminds me of Mary Oliver's poetry, who's another poet I really enjoy, and so I think if you like Mary Oliver, you would maybe check Gary Snyder out. I don't think this is his strongest collection. I would probably recommend reading Turtle Island, which came out back in the 1970s and has a lot of themes of environmentalism, particularly as it relates to the kind of the environmental movement that was happening around the time it came out. So I think that one was a bit more successful than this one, but this one had some fun poems that I liked. I don't really remember any of them specifically, but it was a fun time. I would recommend if you like Gary Snyder or other like beatniks in terms of their poetry. I feel like this was a fine collection, but otherwise I'm not like super recommend it. Then the next book that I gave 3 stars to was Alexis Wright's The Swan book, which I buddy read throughout the month with Lindsay. This is a very literary fiction novel written by Alexis Wright, who's a member of the Wani, which is an indigenous group in Australia. So Lindsay and I were both not super familiar with Indigenous Australians, and so I think this book was very much a learning experience for both of us in terms of better understanding the relationship between Indigenous Australians and the white settler government of Australia, which I think parallels a lot of the relationship between Indigenous Americans and the white American government. But I was very intrigued about this novel. I think there's a lot of interesting threads here in terms of a thematic exploration of that relationship between Indigenous and white people in Australia, about violence against women and against Indigenous people, about environmental degradation and climate change. Like, there's a lot of different things going on here. I don't really have a plot synopsis of this book because you're really just kind of along for the ride. It's following our main character, Olivia, who is an Indigenous young girl who becomes a woman over the course of the novel, as well as Warren Finch, who is an Indigenous Australian but who's also involved kind of in the white government of Australia, and we kind of follow the two of them as they interact with one another. And that's about all I picked up in terms of an actual plot. This definitely is a novel of ideas. Alexis Wright is obviously a very intelligent person, but honestly I just didn't really understand what was going on. I appreciated the ride. I appreciated the experience that this gave me in recognizing that there is some literature out there that is too smart for me, and also literature that is pulling from storytelling traditions and mythologies that I am not familiar with. And so the book is not necessarily written for me as a like white cis woman who lives in America, which is fine. I appreciated this book for kind of reminding me of that and for allowing me to experience a form of storytelling that's very different. I'm not entirely sure if you're looking to read Alexis Wright, as I know she's part of the Reading Women Challenge, which is why I read this book. I'm not sure I'd recommend this to be the place to start. I've heard that her previous novel, Carpentaria, I think is how it's pronounced, is a bit more approachable, and so I'd maybe recommend that. But this one was definitely an interesting reading experience. I got a lot out of it reading it with Lindsay, who I will put a link to down in the description box below. And overall, I mean, I'm glad I read it, and I do feel like it's an experience that I will continue to think about, but unfortunately I was just a little too removed from the story to like appreciate it as much as I think it deserves, if that makes sense. So I only give it 3 stars, but I do think that those who are kind of more well-versed perhaps in the relationship of Indigenous Australians to the white government or culture of Indigenous Australians may get more out of this one than I did. Then the final book that I gave 3 stars to this month, this was a very kind of 3.5 star heavy month, was J. Nicole Jones's Low Country, a Southern Memoir. This one I read also along with Overheated in my April ARC vlog, but it's a memoir. I enjoyed it for the most part. I thought there were some elements that worked better for me than others. I also felt that J. Nicole Jones was kind of a side character during the memoir, which I didn't particularly love. I would be interested in reading more of J. Nicole Jones's work, and I think if you really like memoirs, particularly memoirs that are a bit more like a memoir in essays, that you would probably get along with this one. But as I said, I'm not a huge memoir fan, so I only give it 3 stars. Then another book that I read during that April reading vlog was A Map is Only One Story, 20 Writers on Immigration, Family, and the Meaning of Home, edited by Nicole Chung and Minsa Damari. This is out from Catapult and is an anthology of previously published works from Catapult's magazine that basically touch on ideas of placemaking and home and immigration and different cultural ideas, particularly as an immigrant living in a place where your ancestral culture is much different than the culture that you currently live in. For the most part, I enjoyed these essays. I think a lot of the essays touched on interesting topics, but at the same time were somewhat forgettable. There were a few that I particularly enjoyed. I thought they kind of had a unique voice or were kind of approaching the topic in an interesting way, but overall I thought these were fine. I would still recommend them if these are topics that interest you, but this collection did not particularly blow me out of the water. But I do think I'd be curious to kind of read more from some of the people in here, which is one aspect of an anthology, so it worked in that sense. Then next up, I finished one of the books that has been sitting on my TBR for the absolute longest, which is The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. This, I feel like every person in America has probably already read, so I'm not going to talk a ton about it, but it is Colson Whitehead's literary historical fiction novel that won the National Book Award, I believe back in 2017, I think, because this book was published in 2016, and it follows an enslaved woman by the name of Cora who's on a plantation in southern Georgia and is making her way to the north for freedom following the Underground Railroad, which in this book has been reimagined to be an actual railroad. And I thought there were elements of this that were really well done. I can see why this got the acclaim that it did, because I think at the time it was published, and again I talked about this one a bit in that reading vlog, so forgive me if I'm kind of repeating myself, but I think at the time that this was published, this was playing into a lot of larger discussions in America in the wake of like the transition from Obama's presidency as the first black man who was president to Trump's presidency, who, you know, is a white supremacist. That discussion surrounding identity politics and race in America and the history of racism and slavery in America was a big topic that was happening in 2016. And I think this book played into that quite a bit and was a launching point for a lot of people to kind of have that conversation, as this is a neo-slave narrative that really centers the black experience and how that is rooted in slavery in America, and definitely touches on a lot of the trauma associated with the black experience both during slavery, but then also brings in some pieces that kind of were a part of the Black experience post-slavery that were still rooted in like white supremacy and racism, such as like medical racism is touched on in this book. So I think this book is doing a lot of really important things. Unfortunately, all of the things that happen in this book are things that I was already aware of in terms of America's history. And so this book didn't really teach me anything about the history of slavery and racism in America, particularly given that I read Stamped from the Beginning earlier this year, and I've just read a lot of literature about racism and nonfiction about racism and the history of racism and slavery in America. So I wasn't blown away by this book in terms of those elements. Additionally, I also found Cora, our main character, to just kind of feel somewhat removed. I didn't connect with her a lot as a character. I feel like events happened to her, sometimes to the point that I was like, how can all these events happen to one person? That she felt a bit more representative of a larger group of people, which is actually something that Lindsay mentioned with Olivia in this book as well. So there's some interesting kind of parallels between a main character manifesting as like a larger analog for an entire group of people. I think that was true in both of these books, and unfortunately in both books that didn't really work for me. I like my characters to feel individualized, and Cora just didn't really. I also wished that the Underground Railroad aspect of this book had been a little more involved. I think the idea of it being an actual railroad was really interesting, particularly given the commentary that Whitehead was able to make about how enslaved people in America like literally built the foundations and infrastructure of America. Like, I think that's an important conversation to be had, but at the same time the actual railroad part just didn't really make sense to me, because I'm like, okay, but you can move a lot faster on a train than you can walking, or like on a boat, which is how people actually moved. And so the fact that she gets kind of trapped in different states didn't quite make sense to me, because she's on a train. Like, the train should be able to easily take her to the north over the course of a single day. That part didn't fully work for me, and I didn't entirely understand why he wanted to include it, because I feel like the story would have been just as powerful had it been the historically accurate Underground Railroad. This book also reminded me quite a bit of Beloved by Toni Morrison. However, I think Toni Morrison's book is a bit, I mean, this is Toni Morrison, she's one of the most accomplished like American writers. This book just is a bit more accomplished, and Beloved as a character is so much more fully realized than Cora was. And so I kept thinking back to Beloved as another book about a woman traveling to the north and the sacrifices she has to make, and just thinking of how Beloved just accomplished a bit more in my eyes in terms of the character development and nuance than the Underground Railroad did. So I only ended up giving this 3.5 stars. Obviously, if you've not read it and you are interested in learning more about the history of slavery in America, I definitely would recommend this one. I think this is a great point for those who are less familiar with that kind of subgenre of literature or that discussion in America. I think this book would be helpful to you, but it just wasn't quite fulfilling for me as like a reading experience given my like level of knowledge that I have now. And then moving into another book with a very similar subject matter of the history of racism and slavery and intergenerational trauma in America, Sorrowland by Rivers Solomon. This one I read as an early copy from NetGalley, which is being published by MCD, which is an imprint of FSG, and it's coming out this coming Tuesday, May 4th. This is Solomon's third book, and I've read their previous two works, and I really appreciate the topics that Solomon interacts with in their work. They focus a lot of their attention on, as I said, intergenerational trauma, the Black experience in America, the history of slavery in America, and how that impacts the culture of America today. And so I find those topics really interesting, and I think the way that Solomon uses those topics in kind of science fiction-y, almost horror ways is really fascinating. However, with all three of these books, including this one, the plot itself and the kind of ways that it stands as a novel don't usually work for me for whatever reason. So in Sorrowland, we follow Vern, who's grown up in a very isolated community that pretty much is a cult. Vern is abused there, she is not treated well, and there's definitely some kind of mysterious elements of this cult. But within the cult, Vern has made a friendship with a character by the name of Lucy, who then escapes the cult at some point, and so Vern pledges to follow Lucy and find her outside of the cult. And the story kind of begins shortly after Vern has escaped the community, and we follow Vern over the course of the next several years as different shenanigans ensue, and we learn more about the true purpose of the community that Vern was a part of and kind of its relationship to the government and government control and surveillance. So there's a lot of themes as well in this book about government surveillance, medical racism, experimentation on black bodies is a kind of primary theme of this novel as well. And all of those things were really fascinating, but the actual plot itself I just wasn't super engaged with. I think, one, there were parts of the like science fiction-y elements of this book that I didn't fully understand, and that was also true of some of the previous books. I was just a little confused about the like logistics of the scientific like machinations. So that was happening in this book, and there's also some other characters, but I didn't feel super connected to any of them. Vern is definitely a very well developed character, but the other characters who Vern interacts with, I kind of was confused a bit about their character motivations as well. I do think if you are a previous fan of River Solomon's work, you will probably like this book because it touches on a lot of similar themes. This book also incorporates some discussion about gender identity. River Solomon is non-binary and uses they them pronouns, so there's a lot of discussion here about gender identity and gender fluidity that I think was done pretty well. Overall, I think this book was yet another book that the ideas here were really interesting, but in terms of them all coming together, it didn't quite work for me, which seems to be a common theme with me and River Solomon's books. So perhaps their books are not actually for me, but I keep trying them because the thematic explorations do sound really interesting, and they are usually really fascinating and make me think about things. But then as a novel, I'm just like not super engaged with the story. Then another book I gave 3.75 stars to was yet another buddy read of the month, which was Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczyk. And this is a literary fiction novel that follows a woman named Janina who lives in very rural Poland, very close to the Czech Republic. And she's very interested in animals and astrology. She's very connected to the natural world. And the novel opens with her and one of her neighbors discovering that a third neighbor has died. And so they're kind of figuring out what to do with his body and contacting the police, and the novel kind of takes off from there as more people begin to die. So there's a bit of kind of mystery element to this book. Definitely not a thriller by any means. It's kind of obvious who the like killer is, but it's primarily an exploration, I think, of fate and predetermination and understanding like your place in the world and how you interact with other people. Janina, our main character, is very interested in William Blake's work. She translated it with a former student of hers, and there's a lot of quotes that are put in throughout the book of Blake's work that focus a lot on ideas of predetermination and relating to one another. So I think there's a lot of interesting discussion here about those types of themes. It's also very weird, so if you again like kind of weird fiction, I think you would enjoy this. I've read it with Courtney, who I will put a link to down in the description box below, and we both really enjoyed discussing it together. I think this is a good one to kind of buddy read or read in a group because there's some like theorizing that you can do, and also some fodder for kind of deeper discussions about the larger themes of the books. I did know who the killer was going into the book, so I do think that may have like impacted my overall feelings on this one, but overall I did enjoy it and would recommend it. I also read this for the reading room prompt of reading a book by an author from Eastern Europe, so that was an exciting element of this book as well. Then two books that I read in that April reading vlog. The first of those was Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi, which I gave 4.25 stars to. This was quite a big book here on BookTube back when it came out in 2018, and is a YA fantasy that's inspired by West African mythology. That is a quest fantasy. We're following a main character as she's trying to restore magic to her world, as the king has removed magic. Magic is made illegal, and so people don't practice it anymore. So this book touches a lot on ideas of like resistance and justice, and relates quite a bit to, again, like the Black experience and fighting for freedom and the right to kind of exist, as magic users in this world are like being exterminated by the government. So again, I think this book, when it came out, offered a lot of important dialogue surrounding these topics and the Black Lives Matter movement and what topics were promoted in YA literature, particularly in YA fantasy. So I think, again, this book is a really like seminal book in terms of understanding the course of like the greater dialogue surrounding literature during its time. It also is just like a really fun book. It's super fast paced despite being over 500 pages. So overall, I enjoyed it. I don't know if I'll continue in the series, but I'm glad to have read it because I do think that it's a worthwhile read, and definitely one if you work with teenagers or even like late middle grade readers, that you could include this book in kind of larger discussions of the Black experience in America and just kind of diversity in general and kind of fights for resistance. So yeah, overall I enjoyed this, give it 4.25 stars, would recommend it. Then another book that I read in that reading vlog was To Love and to Loathe by Martha Waters, which I gave 4.5 stars to. This is a historical romance novel that is kind of enemies to lovers. They're not really enemies, but they don't super get along with one another. They kind of got off on the wrong foot when they first met, and since then they've kind of had this like bantering relationship where they pretend that they don't really get along, but actually they get along quite well. It was a super fun historical romance. It definitely like fulfilled the niche of like Bridgerton vibes that I was missing. Their banter was really good. I liked how kind of over the top it was in terms of the historical elements at times. So yeah, overall I really enjoyed it. Would highly recommend if you're a fan of historical romances. I've not read the first one in this series, but I definitely plan on like going back to it. This was also an ARC that I received from Atria Books, and it came out at the beginning of the month, so it's available for you to read now. Then the final 2 books and my top favorite reads of the month were The Story of a New Name by Elena Ferrante. This is the second in the Neapolitan Quartet that begins in My Brilliant Friend, which I read last summer. I'll put a link up to where I talked about it in I think my July wrap up in the cards above, as well as in the description box below. So this is a continuation of that story. I can't really tell you that much about what happens in this one because it spoils the previous one, but I really enjoyed this one. It was pretty slow for me in the first third, I would say, but then something happens. Our characters go to the beach and things start to happen at the beach that I knew were going to happen, but I didn't want them to happen, and watching that train wreck happen was wonderful. I was obsessed. I loved it. These books managed to be so entertaining, yet also touch on and explore really deep and emotional topics, which is something that I find is not common in a lot of literary fiction, and is I think in part why these books are so popular, because they're just so readable, but at the same time are touching on things that are universal experiences, but also experiences that are not always kind of discussed, particularly in terms of like female friendships. These books are just really good. I would highly recommend this entire series. I've only read the first 2 so far, obviously, but I definitely plan on reading the next 2 in the near future. Really enjoyed it. Elena Ferrante continues to be the queen of Italian female friends, I guess. Then finally, my favorite read of the month is Take a Hint, Dani Brown by Talia Hibbert. This one I also read for the Reading Women Challenge. I read this for a book by an author who is neurodivergent, I think, as Talia Hibbert is on the autism spectrum. And this is a contemporary romance that is a fake dating romance, which my sister got me for my birthday, and I loved it. This is quite a booktube darling. I think pretty much everyone in like the romance reading community has read this one and just absolutely raved about it, so I was super excited to read it, although I was somewhat hesitant because the first book in the series, Get a Life, Chloe Brown, I thought was just okay, but this one I loved. I thought it was absolutely perfect. It was hilarious, like actually made me laugh out loud. Our main character also is just like so wonderful. I have seen some people point out that he's like so wonderful to the point of not being realistic, which I think is very fair, but at the same time it's a romance novel, so I didn't really care. I also just think that the way that the 2 of them discuss relationships and the purpose of relationships and how the kind of appropriate decorum of a relationship and how that's all just like totally made up, it should not be like a limiting factor to you being in a relationship. I also just think that their dynamic was really fun to watch. They obviously have a lot of chemistry together, but at the same time have a kind of strong emotional connection that I think really comes through in this book. Dani Brown also is a PhD student. I feel like that was depicted really accurately. Her dedication to her work that sometimes turns into a dedication to the point that she's overworking herself. I think all of the discussion surrounding academia and her being a Black woman in academia, I think was really well done, and also just really accurately portrayed what being a PhD student, particularly a minority PhD student, is like. Overall, I thought this book was fantastic. I gave it 5 stars. Would highly recommend it if you are at all a romance reader, as I think this one was just super fun. So those are the 14 books that I read in the month of April. If you have read any of these books, I'd love to chat with you about them down in the comment section below. Additionally, if you are new to my channel, I'd have you stick around and subscribe. Thank you again. I think I've said this in previous videos, but thank you again to all of my new followers. It's been great as we approach 500 subscribers on this channel. I am potentially thinking of doing a giveaway when I reach 500 subscribers, just of like a book from your favorite little local indie bookstore, not anything too crazy, but if you are interested in that, do let me know down in the comment section below. I hope you're having a great rest of your day whenever you watch this, and I will talk to you next time.